Today is Thursday, September 19th, and you're listening to the Cinemaholics podcast. I'm Jon Negroni, your usual host on the main show, and we have a ton of great stuff for you today on, some of the week's biggest headlines in entertainment. Lots of stuff to talk about. Got some new info on projects coming up, like the upcoming Game of Thrones spinoff, the next film from Bong Joon-ho, the director of Parasite, of course. We have some new info on what's coming next for the Transformers film franchise, and the big story of the week, for me at least, which is the absolutely hellish production of Inside Out 2, what we just learned about it, and how Pixar might legitimately be in some serious trouble. So all that and more coming up. Remember, if you like Cinemaholics and you want to support the program, please consider subscribing to us on your podcast app of choice. So if it's Apple Podcasts or Spotify, be sure to leave us a kind star rating if you'd like. Our email is cinemaholicspodcast@gmail.com if you want to hit us up directly, or you can join the Discord, hang out with other Cinemaholics fans and then some. And lastly, you can leave us a voicemail on the Swell app, where you can ask a question that shows up live on the air, stuff like that. So all that and more is in the show notes. Let's get started. First up, I want to do a quick shout out for The Penguin. This is that new show premiering on the Max streaming service literally today. And apparently, according to a few people I know and trust, it's actually supposed to be kind of great, with one person telling me it might be one of the best shows for them of the entire year. Grain of salt, because I haven't seen the show yet myself. I don't know if they're right or if I'm going to agree, but honestly, after hearing some of the early buzz, I'm definitely a lot more interested in checking this one out than I was even a few days ago, especially because I wasn't the biggest fan, for example, of the Batman, the Matt Reeves version of it, even though it was okay. I liked it fine. All right, speaking of things to get excited about, we just got our first trailer for Bong Joon-ho's Mickey 17. This is a sci-fi movie co-produced by the United States and South Korea. Stars Robert Pattinson, Stephen Yeun, Naomi Ackie, Mark Ruffalo, and Toni Collette. It opens in theaters January 31st, 2025. I did not watch the whole trailer yet myself. I usually like to avoid trailers as much as I can, but I did see some of it auto-playing when I was reading about the story, and I did get a quick glimpse at the visuals, the general atmosphere it's going for. And look, I'm always going to be in line for a Bong Joon-ho movie. That is for sure. Don't get me wrong. But that January 31st release date does give me a little pause, because it does seem to indicate that, maybe they're not expecting too much from this, since that's just a month after the cutoff date for award season. You would think that a new movie from the guy who made Parasite, the Best Picture winner from 2020, and a movie being distributed by Warner Brothers, you'd think that would come out in November, December, right? To be totally fair, I don't know for sure if there are any weird logistics or extenuating circumstances around the movie's production that I'm just not aware of. That might be playing into the pretty awkward release date, which itself, none of this might have anything to do at all with the quality of the film. I don't know. But I do know that the film was originally supposed to come out this past March, but was of course delayed. No idea what's going on there either, but listen, either way, I'm putting all of that aside and hoping for the best, like I would with any new Bong Joon-ho film. All right, got another big release coming in 2025, actually, and that is the new Game of Thrones prequel spin-off series, which is coming to HBO next year, called A Night of the Seven Kingdoms. It's based on George R. R. Martin, the Game of Thrones, of course, wrote the novels, Song of Ice and Fire. He also had these 3 novellas set within that world about a hedge knight who has to serve as a bodyguard to a young Targaryen prince. The show has officially wrapped filming, and we now know there are going to be 6 episodes, and Martin himself is apparently happy with the final product, which is definitely a far cry from his recent reaction to the second season of House of the Dragon, which he did scorch in a blog post that he eventually took down. There's a whole lot of drama around this. I'm not going to get into all of it, but part of his issue with House of the Dragon had to do with how the showrunners handled a major plot point early on in the second season regarding a missing character, how a certain character dies. A lot of this stuff I genuinely agree with Martin on, by the way. And it was surprising to see this happen because Martin had previously been really supportive of House of the Dragon overall. He apparently had nothing but nice things to say about Ryan Condal, the showrunner. That said, one of the biggest complaints I've seen and personally shared with Game of Thrones as a whole cinematic TV universe thing lately has been the decision to cut these seasons down to just 8 episodes with that last season, and now 6 episodes with this new one. And yeah, that's a larger conversation about how these like prestige TV series are becoming so expensive that the streamers are basically penny pinching to the expense of the writers. And that's obviously super frustrating for the creatives behind these stories because you're essentially trying to cram a ton of lore and exposition into a fantasy show that is supposed to be thriving on political dealings and compelling character arcs. That's what makes these shows more exciting than anything. It's not really just like the special effects. So when you cut and cut and cut material and then also release these shows every few years, so there's tons of waiting time in between, it starts to make these projects feel like intermittent movies, not really shows. And maybe that's growing pains for the streaming era, and I would hope that these kinks are going to work themselves out over time. I don't know. But in the meantime, it's increasingly looking like these big budget, high concept shows are starting to transform the industry in maybe not the best ways. But all right, speaking of transforming, see what I did there? We have some new info coming out from Collider about the future of the Transformers film franchise, according to one of its producers. Transformers 1 is coming out this weekend, and the buzz from critics is pretty strong. You can also check out Will Ashton's instant take of the film right now. It's on our feed if you're curious what he has to say about the movie. He did a spoiler-free thing. Regardless, it looks like Paramount and Hasbro are going to be moving forward with a live-action film that will cross over with the G.I. Joe film universe, which the last Transformers film actually did tease. I genuinely completely forgot about that personally because that movie was Transformers Rise of the Beasts, and it's not exactly the most memorable movie, at least for me. Anyway, the producer goes on to say that their goal is to focus more on the point of view of the Transformers themselves as opposed to the humans in these films. He said, quote, "Instead of them reacting to the human plot, their drive has to be part of the story now." So, okay, I think on the one hand, I get why Paramount would have this as a strategy because they clearly seem to see that this animated Transformers 1 movie apparently turned out pretty well without having to add humans to the mix or like revolving around humans at the very least. As in, I think they recognize that audiences don't necessarily need an audience surrogate that they have to relate to like they did in 2007. I mean, I totally get that because they're essentially trying to trust the audience. They're trying to trust that people are going to connect with the motivations of the robot characters so much that you don't really need all these contrived plot machinations to bring in the humans, right? We don't have to have them running around being part of the plot when it doesn't make sense. And especially because a lot of these humans are becoming kind of indistinguishable at this point. So I don't know. They did already do some of this with Rise of the Beast. They sort of made that one human character kind of like a Transformer. And I think the point of the G.I. Joe crossover is that it's to bring in human characters who are more interesting and have established backstories as box office draws. Because yeah, I'm going to be more interested in a G.I. Joe character, I guess, than this random human character who is maybe going through a divorce or something like that. I don't know. On the other hand, maybe I'm being overly optimistic about a film franchise that really, it seemed to wear out its welcome a long time ago, but well, we're getting another one. Doesn't really matter. Okay, I don't want to spend a ton of time on this next headline because it seriously depresses me. We have a new story from Deadline that says that Lionsgate has reportedly signed a deal with an AI firm called Runway in order to train a new generative AI model on their content, which includes helping their filmmakers with pre- and post-production efforts. Quote, "We view AI as a great tool for augmenting, enhancing, and supplementing our current operations." Okay, so this is tough. I hadn't heard of Runway before the story came out. I did see in the Deadline article that they have some existing presence in the industry right now with short films, music videos, things like that. And my stance on AI is pretty simple. If you're using it to inspire creative work, maybe come up with a basis for an artistic expression, that's totally fine by me. It's essentially the same thing as creating a mood board, right? It's trying to just help get you started on a project. But when you start to supplant actual creative work with AI-generated slop, that is where I have a serious problem. Because that's generally plagiarism, first of all, because especially in the image side of this, they're sourcing existing artwork and then not crediting the people who created that. And I find that to be extremely lazy. And this is a way for these studios, let's be honest, to make a quick buck off of artists without having to pay them. And I do not support that whatsoever. And it kind of ties into the next big story. To be totally clear, I'm not talking about every single application of AI that there is, but I am specifically talking about generative AI in this context as trying to pass off things like written or visual work as original stuff. And a big thing of that is it A, exploits the people who did make that stuff, and B, the effects of this are you have fewer and fewer people actually making things, and that's not good. So that to me is a red line that we absolutely should not cross. I do not like this news story, and I'm very, very sad about it. And now that I'm all fired up and upset, on to the main story. And look, this one, when I first read about this, I genuinely came so close to just turning off the internet for a week, because we have some new information coming out about the production of Inside Out 2 via IGN. Now, keep in mind, Inside Out 2, it came out this past summer through Disney and Pixar. It's the highest grossing animated movie, not just of 2024, but of all time, worldwide. That success, unfortunately, apparently, came with a serious cost to its staff. 10 former Pixar employees who were recently laid off shared details on what was apparently an extremely toxic production that ironically contrasts with the film's message about mental health. For context, Pixar laid off 14% of its staff in May. They also laid off folks last year as well, which means that some of these laid off employees were unable to benefit from a bonus for the success of Inside Out 2. A bonus, by the way, that a lot of these animators rely on, because unlike other animators at Disney, Pixar employees are not unionized. They're not part of the TAG, and therefore they aren't paid as well. So basically, these people work tirelessly to get this movie, a movie critical to the further existence of the studio, mind you, which we'll get into, to release on time after the writer's strike, both of the strikes last year. And then these people were laid off right before the release. And then they had to sit there and watch as the studio raked in $1.6 billion with none of it, not a cent, going to them. And that alone makes me just unbelievably furious. Not only is it morally wrong, clearly, but it also speaks to a total disregard for its employees that will absolutely have reverberating effects at the studio for years to come. This is the sort of thing that has long-lasting negative effects on the morale of a studio, which has its own consequences. And let's talk about the, quote, unprecedented crunch that surrounded the production of the movie, because that's a whole thing unto itself. It's worth pointing out that Pixar has had a very long history of putting movies out under seriously tight circumstances. A lot of studios do, right? And for Pixar itself, you can look at movies like Toy Story 2, for instance. And, by the way, the person who saved that film from being deleted was laid off last September. So just putting that out there. Anyway, IGN in this report did point out that at least one senior executive at Pixar told them that the crunch at the end of Inside Out 2 was no different from other films that they've put out. But here's what the workers had to say, all of whom spoke under the condition of anonymity. One source said, quote, "I think for a month or two, the animators were working 7 days a week. Ridiculous amounts of production workers, just people being tossed into jobs they'd never really done before. It was horrendous." Another source called it, quote, "the largest crunch in the studio's history." And one person said, quote, "I would venture that at least 95% of the people that got laid off are financially effed right now." So I highly encourage you to read the full report from IGN. It's excellent reporting, definitely a wake-up call for the entertainment industry. And those of us like me who covered the success of Inside Out 2 with all this positivity and good vibing, I was so happy that the movie was doing so well while all this awful stuff was happening right in plain sight to the people who made it happen. And hey, there was another bit in this report about how apparently the studio pushed for them to avoid anything relating to LGBTQ themes and allegedly editing some content out of the movie for that very reason. Okay, so multiple sources claimed that Disney leadership internally blamed much of the failure of Lightyear, for example, on the same-sex kiss in that film. Remember in Lightyear? You probably didn't watch it, but in Lightyear, there is a scene where during a montage, literally a woman kisses her wife literally like less than a second in that moment. Quote, "It is, as far as I know, still a thing where leadership, they'll bring up Lightyear specifically and say, oh, Lightyear was a financial failure because it had a queer kiss in it," one source told IGN. "That's not the reason the movie failed," says this source. Exactly. I'll touch more on Lightyear in particular in just a second, but also from the report, quote, the apparent hesitance to touch on LGBTQ themes storylines in particular affected Inside Out 2's development, according to several of our sources. Multiple people recall hearing about continuous notes to make Riley, the main character of both Inside Out movies, come across as less gay, leading to numerous edits that ramped up around September 2023 after the resolution of the WGA strike. Sources describe rumors that there was special care put into making the relationship between Riley and Val, a supporting character introduced in Inside Out 2, seem as platonic as possible, even requiring edits to the lighting and tone of certain scenes to remove any trace of romantic chemistry. One source describes it as just doing a lot of extra work to make sure that no one would potentially see them as not straight. This isn't just sad, it's embarrassing. This whole idea, too, about a tiny but obnoxious group of people complaining that seeing two gay people exist in a movie would be confusing. This is the same line of reasoning that people used to argue about interracial relationships in movies, things like segregation. It's absolutely disgusting. This screams to me that there are some folks high up at Disney, and I'm not surprised about this, who are consuming a lot of the right-wing culture war content stuff on YouTube and social media and all that, none of which has any real provable connection to the real world box office. Because just take a look at a movie like Barbie, for example. Conservatives raged about that movie, told the whole world it was woke, that it was going to go broke and all this stuff. It made $1.4 billion. One of the most feminist mainstream movies ever made. Think of it this way. If Wish from last year, that Disney animated movie that bombed, if it had some kind of LGBTQ pandering in it, like let's say a character offhandedly referenced a same-sex partner like we saw in Onward, and then let's say Wish bombed the way it did anyway, these same online weirdos would all say that the movie failed because something gay people. And then some in the Disney leadership would look at this stuff and say, see, these movies aren't failing because they're bad or we mismanaged everything. It's the gay people's fault. So look, these people are in a bubble, and the vast majority of people in this country absolutely do not care about this stuff. It reminds me of when conservatives managed to convince a bunch of Disney higher-ups to fire James Gunn because of his old tweets. Then they just ended up with egg on their face over the whole thing. They hired him back to do Guardians of the Galaxy 3 years later after losing him to DC. And when you know it, that last Guardians movie was pretty much their only decent hit in all of 2023. I could talk about this all day, but the bottom line is that some of these movies like Lightyear were just plain bad movies, and the choice to blame their failure on gay people is 100% reactionary, bigoted BS. The LGBTQ community is one of the most important fan communities behind Disney films. So for the studio to treat them like this, it's reprehensible and unfortunately unsurprising, considering how they've been treating their own employees when it came to Inside Out 2, for instance. Again, I could keep going on with this because the report has even more info. It's so wild. Like a lot of these issues are also affecting the next Pixar film, Elio, for example. They, and by they I mean Pete Docter, basically want to take this same crunch work culture thing and replicate it for future movies. And speaking of Docter, it looks like Pixar is apparently backsliding into the John Lasseter days where they're overly relying on one guy to be the main vision and gatekeeper behind everything. That's not to say Docter is a bad dude. I've met the guy in real life. If you don't know who he is, he was the director of Up, and he apparently did a lot of Inside Out, and he apparently did a lot of like last minute work on Inside Out too. He's clearly really good at his job. The former employees in this report even go to bat for him on a personal level. They defend him, right? But he is like the head honcho at Pixar right now. And it's just sad that Pixar briefly entered this era of bringing in new voices and talent. And it was genuinely working for films like Turning Red, for example. And to be fair, Domi Shi, the director of that, is now the co-director of Elio, replacing Adrian Molina. So I'm not saying that this is a totally black and white thing and that Pixar is completely bad all the time. Like, that's not what I'm saying. But it just seems like they are slowly reverting back to their old ways the second things get a little complicated. And look, I know there's a nuanced conversation to be had about how Pixar really did have a ton on the line with Inside Out 2. And folks at the studio may downplay it, but let's be real. The stakes were astronomically high. The studio was in serious danger of just collapsing if Inside Out 2 was not a massive hit. And these layoffs didn't come from nowhere. I mean, let's review it. Thanks to COVID, 4 of Pixar's movies from 2020 to 2022, so that includes Onward, Soul, Luca, and Turning Red, they were basically a wash because theaters shut down. The studio was hesitant about bringing them back to theaters again, and people were starting to expect these things to just show up on Disney+. That was a whole other mess I could spend an hour on. But then they did return to theaters with Lightyear, which bombed, and then Elemental a year later, which only did sort of okay box office. And this report even mentions that these movies now have to make $600 million or more to even be considered profitable. And Elemental was just under that threshold. And on top of that, apparently these movies aren't actually considered a true hit unless they manage to cross $1 billion. I mean, does that sound sustainable to you that every Pixar movie has to be $1 billion or more? That's unbelievably ridiculous. And it's a whole other tangent I could get lost in, but I'll finish with this. Disney, Pixar, you have the audacity to make a movie like Inside Out, which is about mental health and anxiety and overworking yourself being bad for you and your community and so on and so on. The irony is obvious, but even going further than that, you should probably listen to the people who work for you and maybe look at them more as people instead of numbers on a spreadsheet, because how they were treated after saving your skin, with some of these folks literally being locked out of Pixar and told they couldn't pick up their things during normal work hours to avoid making the remaining employees feel awkward. It's just so despicable, and from what I can tell, a shift from how Pixar used to do things. It genuinely makes me far nervous about the future of Pixar than ever before, and I think for good reason. So I'll end it with this quote from a former employee. Quote, Disney invested $1.5 billion in Fortnite. 1% of that $1.5 billion would have saved all our jobs. Yeah, that's the future of Pixar right there. That's why I'm worried. So, again, please read the whole report. It is worth your time, and I have linked it in the show notes, of course. And thank you for listening to what was ultimately a very negative, unfortunately, and very sad version of me doing these things, but I hope you enjoyed it. I'm not even sure how to say that, so I'll leave it there. Thanks for listening as always, and we'll be back soon with hopefully some reviews coming up. We don't have a ton of new releases on the horizon, but we'll be keeping you informed, that's for sure. See you later, everybody.